For more than 30 years, this case has remained unresolved. It was not ignored, it was not rushed, and it was not handled without care. From the moment it entered official records, it was documented, reviewed, and preserved according to the standards of its time. Investigators followed established procedures. They recorded what could be confirmed, labeled what could not, and resisted drawing conclusions without evidence. And yet, the case did not reach certainty. This is not unusual, but it is often misunderstood. In public memory, unresolved cases are sometimes framed as puzzles waiting for a missing piece, or as failures waiting to be corrected. That framing is simple, but it is not accurate. Some cases remain unresolved because the limits of knowledge were reached, not because effort was absent. Tonight, we are not here to solve a case. We are not here to assign responsibility, and we are not here to reinterpret events beyond what the record supports. This review differs from typical true crime presentations in one important way. It does not treat uncertainty as mystery. It does not treat absence of answers as evidence, and it does not treat unresolved cases as invitations for speculation. Instead, it treats them as records shaped by process, records shaped by documentation, and records shaped by the professional discipline to acknowledge limits rather than exceed them. What follows is an examination of process, documentation, and limits, not a search for blame. And it begins with the case file itself. Only what can be verified, only what was recorded, and only what still holds up. At this stage, commentary stops. What follows is drawn directly from investigative records, contemporaneous documentation, and preserved case materials. Each element is presented according to its classification. No meaning will be assigned. No theory will be introduced. Only what the record supports. Confirmed. The individual at the center of this case is a teenage girl identified in records as Danielle Harper. This name is used here for clarity and continuity with the case file. Confirmed. Danielle Harper was 17 years old at the time she was reported missing. Confirmed. She resided in Riverside County, California, within the United States. These facts are established through official identification, family confirmation, and law enforcement documentation. Documented. Danielle lived with a family member at the time of her disappearance. Household arrangements were described in interviews and recorded in investigative notes. There is no documentation indicating recent changes to her living situation. Documented. School records indicate that Danielle was enrolled in a local high school. Attendance logs show periods of inconsistency in the months preceding her disappearance. This information was recorded by school officials and later reviewed by investigators as part of background context. Documented. Family members reported that Danielle had, on prior occasions, left home without advance notice. These absences were typically brief and resolved without external involvement. Investigators recorded this history as part of behavioral context. No interpretation was attached to this information. Documented. There were reports from family and school personnel indicating that Danielle had engaged in occasional rule-breaking behavior consistent with adolescence. This included curfew violations and social activity that required parental correction. No documentation indicates involvement in organized criminal activity or sustained unlawful behavior. Confirmed. The last confirmed sighting of Danielle occurred on a specific date in Riverside County. This sighting was supported by independent documentation and is recognized in the case file as the final confirmed point in the timeline. Reported. Following the last confirmed sighting, several individuals contacted authorities to report possible encounters with someone they believed to be Danielle. These reports were recorded in full, including dates, locations, and descriptions provided by the reporting individuals. However, none of these reports could be independently verified through additional witnesses, physical evidence, or corroborating records. As a result, they were preserved as reported information and excluded from the official timeline. Documented. Investigators conducted interviews with immediate family members, extended relatives, classmates, neighbors, and school staff. Each interview was logged, dated, and summarized. Where statements aligned, that alignment was noted. Where statements differed, those differences were recorded without resolution. Confirmed. A review of Danielle Harper's living space was conducted shortly after the report of her disappearance. Investigative notes indicate that personal belongings were present and accounted for. There were no recorded signs of forced entry or disturbance. No written message indicating intent to leave was documented. Documented. Available personal records were reviewed within the limits of the period's technology. These included phone records accessible at the time, contact lists, and known social connections. The information obtained did not establish a confirmed destination or planned absence. Confirmed. Search efforts were initiated in accordance with missing person procedures applicable to minors. These actions included local area canvassing, coordination with school officials, and notification of relevant agencies. Each action was recorded along with the date and outcome. No confirmed sightings resulted from these efforts. Documented. Throughout the investigation, clear distinctions were maintained between confirmed facts, documented background information, and reported but never verified accounts. This structure is consistent across all preserved versions of the case file. At this point, the record establishes the following without dispute. Danielle Harper was 17 years old. She lived in Riverside County, California. She had a documented history of occasional rule-breaking consistent with adolescence. Her last confirmed sighting occurred on a specific date and location. Subsequent reported sightings could not be verified. Standard procedures for a missing minor were followed and recorded. These points define the factual boundary of the case. They do not explain what happened. They do not indicate intent. They do not suggest an outcome. They simply establish what is known. With the case file opened and the verified information clearly defined, the next step is to understand the environment in which this investigation unfolded, the social expectations of the time, the tools investigators had available, and the procedures that guided their decisions. That context shapes everything that follows, and that is where we turn next. To understand how this case was handled, it is necessary to pause the timeline, not to reconsider decisions, not to apply modern judgment, but to understand the environment investigators worked within at the time. Cases do not exist in isolation. They are shaped by the tools, procedures, and assumptions of their era. This disappearance occurred during a period when investigative work relied heavily on physical records, in-person interviews, and localized coordination. Digital systems, as they exist today, were either limited or not yet in use. There were no centralized national databases capable of instant cross-referencing. There was no routine access to real-time location data. Communication between agencies depended largely on phone calls, written requests, and mailed documentation. Information moved at the speed of process, not immediacy. Missing person investigations involving minors followed defined procedures, but those procedures reflected the standards of the period. Initial assessments focused on establishing whether the absence appeared voluntary or involuntary, based on known behavior, recent interactions, and environmental factors. This distinction mattered because it determined which resources could be assigned and how quickly additional agencies became involved. These assessments were not conclusions, they were starting points. Investigators gathered information through direct contact, speaking with family members, educators, neighbors, and peers. Statements were handwritten or typed, then filed. Revisions required formal updates. Errors could not be corrected instantly. Evidence handling emphasized preservation, but forensic analysis options were limited. DNA testing was not routinely available. Trace analysis existed, but required specific conditions and resources. Many techniques now considered standard were either unavailable or used only in specialized circumstances. As a result, investigations relied heavily on timelines. When someone was last seen, who saw them, what could be confirmed. These timelines were constructed carefully, often from memory rather than digital records. Investigators understood that memory could change over time, but there were few alternatives. Communication with the public followed different norms as well. There were no social media platforms to distribute images instantly. There were no online tip forms. Information was shared through local media outlets, printed bulletins, and community postings. Public awareness depended on geography and timing. Media involvement was present, but it operated within narrower reach. Coverage was often brief unless new information emerged. Sustained attention was rare without developments. This environment influenced how pressure was applied and how expectations were managed. Investigators worked knowing that follow-up depended on manual coordination. Leads required time to verify. Mistakes were harder to detect quickly. Within law enforcement agencies, case reviews occurred periodically, not continuously. Cold case units, where they existed, were smaller and had limited resources. Files were reviewed by physically reopening them. Evidence was re-examined manually. New insights depended on new information, not new technology. This context is critical. It explains why certain decisions were prioritized. It explains why some avenues were documented but could not be fully explored. And it explains why the absence of answers did not indicate absence of effort. Standards of evidence were also different. Investigators were trained to avoid extending conclusions beyond what could be supported. Assumptions were recorded cautiously. Speculation was intentionally excluded from official reports. This discipline protected cases from error, but it also meant that unresolved elements remained unresolved. In missing person cases involving teenagers, investigators also balanced competing possibilities. Adolescents sometimes left home temporarily. They sometimes avoided contact. They sometimes returned without incident. These patterns were known and documented. Investigators were trained to consider them without dismissing risk. This balance influenced how urgency was applied and how resources were allocated. Understanding this does not explain the outcome of the case, but it explains the process, and it establishes a foundation for reviewing the investigation fairly, as it was conducted, not as it might be imagined today. With this context in place, we can now return to the case itself, not to reinterpret it, but to examine how investigators proceeded step by step, using the information they had and the standards they followed. That examination begins with the original investigation and why, at the time, its conclusions were considered reasonable. With the case file established and the historical context understood, we can now examine how investigators approached this disappearance when it was first reported. This is not a reassessment, it is an explanation. At the time Danielle Harper was reported missing, investigators began with the information immediately available to them. That information shaped every decision that followed. The first priority was verification. Investigators confirmed Danielle's identity, age, residence, and last known location. They established who had last seen her, when that sighting occurred, and under what circumstances. These steps were completed before any broader conclusions were considered. This sequence mattered because without a confirmed timeline, further action could not proceed responsibly. Once the last confirmed sighting was established, investigators focused on reconstructing Danielle's recent movements. They conducted interviews with family members, school staff, peers, and neighbors. Each interview was documented separately. When accounts aligned, that alignment was noted. When accounts differed, those differences were recorded without resolution. This approach reflected standard investigative discipline. At this stage, investigators also reviewed Danielle's recent behavior as reported by family and school officials. This review was not intended to assign character or intent. It served a procedural function. Under the standards of that period, prior behavior helped investigators determine whether the disappearance might fit patterns previously observed in similar cases. In Danielle's case, there was documentation of occasional absences from home that resolved without external involvement. This history did not determine the investigation's outcome, but it influenced early assessments regarding urgency and scope. Given the information available at the time, it was reasonable for investigators to consider multiple possibilities simultaneously. They did not rule out risk. They did not assume a specific outcome. They proceeded methodically. Search efforts were initiated according to established procedures. Local areas connected to Danielle's routine were canvassed. School environments were reviewed. Known social connections were examined within the limits of available records. Each step followed documented guidelines. Investigators also evaluated reported sightings. These reports were taken seriously and recorded in detail. Follow-up efforts were made where feasible. However, without independent verification, these reports could not be incorporated into the official timeline. This was not dismissal, it was adherence to evidentiary standards. From an investigative standpoint, maintaining a clear distinction between confirmed information and unverified accounts protected the integrity of the case file. Investigators also assessed the physical environment connected to Danielle's disappearance. Reviews of her residence and known locations did not produce evidence indicating forced entry or immediate disruption. This absence of physical indicators influenced how conclusions were framed. It did not provide answers, but it narrowed the scope of what could be stated with confidence. As the initial phase progressed, investigators documented every lead pursued and every avenue examined. When leads did not produce results, they were closed with notation explaining why. This documentation served a future purpose. It allowed subsequent reviewers to understand not only what was done, but why certain paths were not continued. Over time, as no new confirmed information emerged, the case transitioned into a maintenance phase. This transition followed standard practice. The case was not abandoned, it was preserved. Periodic reviews occurred. Records were checked against new information when available, but without new evidence, the original conclusions remained unchanged. Under the standards of that period, this outcome was considered reasonable. Investigators had followed procedures, they had documented their work, they had avoided unsupported conclusions. Importantly, they did not claim certainty where none existed. This restraint is sometimes misunderstood in retrospect, but at the time, it reflected professionalism. From an investigative standpoint, the case did not fail because it reached an incorrect conclusion. It remained unresolved because it reached the limits of what could be established with the tools. Even the most thorough investigation is shaped by the boundaries of its time. To understand the unfolding of this case, it is necessary to consider what was simply beyond reach for investigators in the early 1990s. First, technological limitations. At the time, many tools now considered standard in investigative work were not available. Digital databases for cross-referencing missing person reports across states were limited or non-existent. National criminal information systems were still evolving. Investigators relied primarily on physical records, handwritten logs, and telephone communications. Information that today could be retrieved instantly required days or weeks to verify. Second, forensic limitations. DNA analysis existed, but it was restricted to specialized laboratories and specific circumstances. There were no rapid tests for trace evidence. Fingerprint analysis required access to centralized databases that were not comprehensive. Subtle physical evidence could only be evaluated if it was already collected, preserved, and suitable for analysis. Investigators could document and store evidence carefully, but they could not test what they did not possess the resources or technology to examine. Third, communication between jurisdictions. Cooperation across counties, states, and agencies depended on formal channels. Requests for records or updates often traveled by mail or through scheduled phone calls. Information was not instantaneous. Follow-up depended on persistence, patience, and careful documentation. Investigators could not assume that information in another jurisdiction would arrive quickly or even be available at all. Fourth, behavioral and social assumptions of the time. Training and policy required investigators to consider patterns they had observed in prior cases. Adolescents leaving home temporarily, for example, were often treated as voluntary absences until evidence indicated otherwise. Social and cultural norms influenced which actions were considered cause for immediate concern. These assessments were procedural, not judgmental. They reflected the standards under which the officers operated. Fifth, standards of evidence. Investigators could not draw conclusions without documented support. Reports, interviews, physical evidence all required verification. Statements could not be accepted without confirmation, and unverified accounts could not be added to the official timeline. From a modern perspective, some opportunities may appear overlooked, but at the time, extending the record beyond what could be substantiated would have violated professional standards. Sixth, resource limitations. Even in well-resourced counties, investigative teams were constrained. Staffing, laboratory capacity, and time allocated to each case determined the pace of progress. Cases that lacked immediate evidence required preservation until new information emerged. This meant that unresolved questions could not always be pursued simultaneously. Investigators prioritized based on documented evidence and reasonable likelihood of results. Finally, it is important to note that what seems obvious today was often invisible then. A timeline gap, a missing connection, or a small procedural detail may now stand out in hindsight. But investigators did not have the benefit of future tools, data aggregation, or modern analytical methods. Their conclusions were based strictly on what was documented, verifiable, and immediately actionable. These limitations explain why certain questions remain unanswered. They also explain why the investigation, though methodical, did not yield resolution. It was not a result of neglect or error, but of the practical boundaries of the period. Understanding these constraints is essential for evaluating the case fairly. It establishes that unresolved elements were the result of circumstance, not oversight. It underscores the importance of distinguishing between what was unknowable at the time and what could have been confirmed. The next step in this review is to separate clearly what remains established and uncontested from what continues to be unknown or unresolved. This distinction forms the foundation for understanding both the strength of the investigation and the enduring questions that remain. By framing the case in this way, we can respect the work of investigators while acknowledging the limitations imposed by time, technology, and procedure. It is through this lens that the next section, What We Know, must be approached. Having examined the limitations investigators faced, we now turn to the information that remains established and uncontested, the elements of the case that have withstood decades of review without dispute. It is important to remember, this is not speculation, this is not interpretation. This is the factual foundation upon which all subsequent review rests. Confirmed. Danielle Harper was 17 years old at the time of her disappearance. Confirmed. She resided in Riverside County, California, and was living with family members. Confirmed. Her last verified sighting occurred on a specific date and location within her local community. This sighting is corroborated by multiple sources, including contemporaneous records documented by investigators. Documented. Danielle had a history of occasional absences from her home that were brief and resolved without external intervention. This pattern was recorded in family and school reports and noted in investigative files. Investigators considered this behavior when assessing potential risk, but it did not determine conclusions. Confirmed. Investigators conducted thorough interviews with family, peers, educators, and known associates. Each interview was recorded and preserved, including dates, locations, and statements provided. Where statements agreed, that agreement was documented. Where statements differed, the discrepancies were noted without drawing conclusions. Confirmed. Investigators conducted searches of Danielle's residence and nearby areas. No evidence of forced entry or disruption was recorded. Personal belongings were present and accounted for. These findings are documented in the official case file and have remained consistent in all subsequent reviews and cold case re-examinations. Documented. Search efforts extended to locations associated with Danielle's routine. Canvassing of neighbors, schools, and known social contacts was undertaken in accordance with the standard procedures for missing minors at the time. Each step of these efforts was logged, including dates and outcomes. No new confirmed sightings were produced. Reported. Several additional sightings were reported in the days following Danielle's disappearance. Each was documented with details of date, location, and description. However, none of these reports could be independently verified through additional witnesses or physical evidence. Consequently, they were preserved as reported information and not incorporated into the confirmed timeline. Confirmed. Investigators preserved and reviewed all available records, including school attendance logs, phone records accessible at the time, and known social contacts. These records were incorporated into the official documentation. They provided context for Danielle's movements and associations, but did not produce new confirmed information regarding her whereabouts. Confirmed. The distinction between confirmed, documented, and reported information was maintained rigorously. Every entry in the case file reflects this careful classification, which has remained consistent through subsequent reviews and cold case re-examinations. Taken together, the verified information establishes a factual foundation. Danielle Harper, 17, living in Riverside County. Last confirmed sighting at a known date and location. Occasional, previously documented absences consistent with adolescence. No evidence of disruption at her residence. Search and documentation conducted in accordance with procedures. Reported sightings remained unverified. This foundation is critical because it separates certainty from conjecture. It allows us to clearly understand what investigators could rely upon and what remained beyond verification. It also sets the stage for examining the areas where questions persist.
the elements of the case that remain unresolved despite careful documentation and review. The next section, What We Don't Know, will address these gaps, not to speculate, but to explain why these questions remain open even decades later. By distinguishing the established facts from the unknown, we maintain respect for both the subject of the case and the investigators who followed proper procedures under the conditions of their time. This approach ensures that the review remains factual, educational, and measured,
Having established the facts that remain uncontested, it is now necessary to examine the elements that remain unresolved. This is not an exercise in conjecture. It is an explanation of why certain questions remain unanswered even after decades of investigation. Gaps in the timeline. Despite meticulous documentation, there are moments for which no verified record exists. Investigators recorded the last confirmed sighting, but subsequent movements cannot be established with certainty. The absence of confirmed information does not imply neglect. It reflects the natural limitations of record-keeping, the availability of witnesses, and the procedures of the time. Conflicting statements. Some interviews contained differences in detail. Witnesses remembered times, locations, or interactions differently. Investigators documented these discrepancies carefully. These differences were not ignored. They were recorded as part of the official case file. At the time, resolving these inconsistencies was not always possible because corroborating evidence was unavailable. Inconclusive evidence. Physical and documentary evidence existed, but did not lead to definitive conclusions. Phone records, school logs, and social connections offered partial context, but they could not establish movements or intentions beyond verified points. Investigators preserved this evidence, understanding its potential future relevance. However, in the absence of confirmation, it remained inconclusive. Questions investigators openly acknowledged. Throughout the original investigation and subsequent reviews, investigators noted specific questions that could not be answered with certainty. These included where Danielle Harper was between her last confirmed sighting and the first reported observation by others, whether reported sightings represented her or someone else, why no physical evidence emerged that could indicate a change in location or circumstances. These questions were recorded in official logs, illustrating that investigators were aware of gaps and approached them with professional caution. Limits of contemporaneous methods. Investigators worked without modern forensic tools, digital tracking, or real-time databases. In some cases, witnesses could not be contacted immediately, and follow-up was delayed by the practical realities of communication at the time. Information that might appear obvious today was not available to them then. This gap explains why certain questions were never answered, despite the thoroughness of the investigation. Maintaining distinctions. Throughout the case, investigators deliberately maintained a distinction between confirmed facts, which could be verified independently, documented background information, which provided context, and reported but unverified information, which could not be relied upon for conclusions. This discipline ensured that unresolved elements were identified transparently rather than ignored or misrepresented. Why the unknowns remain important. Understanding what cannot be confirmed is as crucial as understanding what can. It demonstrates that unresolved aspects of the case are a product of circumstance, procedure, and available resources, not of negligence. It also prepares the viewer to interpret subsequent analysis with clarity. By acknowledging limits openly, we respect both the investigative process and the integrity of the historical record. Summary. Certain gaps in the timeline cannot be resolved. Conflicting statements exist, but were documented carefully. Some evidence remains inconclusive due to technological and procedural limitations. Investigators recognized these limits and recorded them transparently. These unresolved elements are not mysteries in the traditional sense. They are realities of investigative work constrained by time, tools, and human factors. The next segment will examine a particular detail within the case that, though subtle at the time, now draws attention. This detail demonstrates how standards and procedures evolve over time, and how professional review can reveal nuances without speculation. By approaching the unknown systematically, we prepare to examine the case with both rigor and respect. As we move forward, it is important to recognize that even in cases where procedures were followed carefully, some details may gain attention over time simply because standards, tools, and perspectives evolve. This is not a statement about error. It is a reflection of how investigative work is conducted and reviewed over decades. In this case, one specific detail within the timeline draws interest upon closer examination. At the time of the investigation, it was documented that Danielle Harper was last confirmed in a specific location on a particular day. Investigators constructed her timeline based on eyewitness accounts and corroborated observations. However, there was a small window between her last confirmed sighting and the next recorded report, in which certain movements could not be independently verified. At the time, this gap was acknowledged in the records, but did not stand out as unusual. Investigators focused on confirmed sightings and pursued leads with available evidence. There was no indication that this interval required special attention beyond standard protocol. What has changed over time is not the facts themselves, but the way investigators and reviewers now interpret procedural details. Modern standards emphasize comprehensive digital timelines, cross-referencing multiple sources, and continuous verification of even brief gaps. When this interval is reviewed today, it appears as a point of interest because contemporary methods allow for deeper analysis. It is important to note, however, that this retrospective attention is not an accusation. It does not imply oversight or error. It reflects the evolution of investigative methodology and technological capability. This detail also illustrates a broader principle. Investigative work is always constrained by the tools and procedures of the time. What could be confirmed in the 1990s was inherently different from what can be confirmed today. Small gaps, subtle inconsistencies, and intervals that were routine then may now attract notice because they can be examined in ways that were previously unavailable. In practical terms, this particular interval does not solve the case, nor does it explain the disappearance. It simply represents an area where modern review can highlight procedural nuance. It also demonstrates the discipline and caution applied by investigators. They did not speculate, they did not assign causation, and they did not record assumptions as facts. Their documentation remains consistent and defensible. For viewers, this serves as a reminder of the difference between interest and consequence. A detail may draw attention without implying wrongdoing. A gap in a timeline may be notable without being meaningful beyond the context of process. In reviewing cases across decades, it is common for certain elements to age differently, not because they were overlooked, but because standards evolve, analytical tools improve, and modern review allows for refined observation. Finally, it is worth emphasizing that the focus here is always on facts, process, and methodology. We are not adding narrative drama. We are not creating speculation. We are observing how professional review and changing standards can illuminate aspects of a case that were previously routine or unremarkable. This perspective sets the stage for the next segment, Lessons in Investigative Methodology. By examining this case carefully, including the details that have gained attention over time, viewers can understand the principles behind professional investigation, including the value of timelines, evidence preservation, and reassessment. In this way, the case transcends narrative interest and becomes an educational example of procedural rigor and evolving investigative practice. At this point, it becomes possible to step back from the specifics of the case and consider what it illustrates about investigative practice more broadly, not in terms of outcomes, but in terms of method. Unresolved cases often attract attention because of what is missing. This case is instructive because of what was done deliberately, carefully, and within established limits. One lesson concerns timelines. Investigators relied on confirmed sightings and verifiable records to construct a sequence of events. Where confirmation was unavailable, they resisted the temptation to fill gaps with assumption. This restraint preserved the integrity of the record, even though it left questions unanswered. Modern investigators continue to follow this principle, even as tools improve. Technology may allow for finer detail, but the discipline of verification remains essential. Another lesson involves assumptions. Investigators are trained to consider behavioral patterns without allowing those patterns to become conclusions. In this case, documented prior behavior informed early assessments, but it did not define the investigation's outcome. This distinction is critical. Patterns guide inquiry. They do not determine truth. Professional investigations depend on maintaining this separation. Evidence preservation is another central lesson. Although some forms of analysis were unavailable at the time, investigators preserved records, statements, and physical materials according to procedure. This preservation allowed for later review without distortion. Even when evidence does not resolve a case, its careful handling ensures that future examination remains possible. This is a principle that continues to guide modern investigative standards. The case also demonstrates the importance of reevaluation over time. Cases are not static. They exist within systems that change. Tools evolve, standards shift, new methods emerge. Re-examination does not imply prior failure. It reflects professional responsibility. Modern investigators approach unresolved cases with the understanding that clarity may emerge not from new events, but from improved methods of review. Finally, this case illustrates the value of documenting uncertainty. Investigators recorded unanswered questions openly. They acknowledged gaps without attempting to resolve them prematurely. This transparency strengthens credibility. It allows future reviewers to understand both what was known and what was not, and why. Taken together, these lessons elevate the case beyond narrative interest. They demonstrate how professional investigation functions when certainty cannot be achieved. They show that careful work does not always produce resolution, but it does produce a reliable historical record. With these methodological insights in mind, we can now turn to a final reflection, not about answers, but about endurance. After decades of review, documentation, and reassessment, this case remains unresolved. Not because it was ignored, not because it lacked effort, but because certainty is sometimes beyond reach. This distinction matters. It reminds us that investigations operate within limits of time, evidence, memory, and method. When those limits are reached, responsible investigators do not invent answers, they preserve the record. This case endures because it reflects the reality of professional inquiry. It shows how careful documentation can coexist with uncertainty, how disciplined investigation can conclude without resolution, and how unanswered questions do not automatically indicate failure. It also endures because it represents a person, not a narrative. A teenage girl whose disappearance was recorded carefully, reviewed repeatedly, and remembered within official files. Acknowledging her does not require speculation, it requires respect. For those who work in investigative fields, this case remains a reference point. For those who study procedure, it offers instruction. And for those who value careful examination, it serves as a reminder that truth is sometimes defined not by answers, but by honesty about what cannot be known. This review has not sought conclusions, it has sought clarity between what is known and what is not, between documentation and assumption, between certainty and probability. This case remains unresolved not because it was ignored, but because certainty is sometimes beyond reach. If you value careful examinations like this, you're welcome to continue with us. No urgency, no promise of answers.